Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Children's Bible Quiz. I'm your host, Reverend Jake Zabel, the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional, Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion, also known as the COELC. And joined with me on this episode are my contestants on my right. Coming in at 6.5 years old, the acolyte of might, Heinrich!
Hello.
And on my left, the pastor of disaster, the future bishop of the COELC, coming in at only 5 years old, Hezekiah!
Hello.
Yeah, so, gone to pastor disaster. He's not a pastor yet, but he's a pastor in training, aren't you, Hezekiah? Well, not right now, but in the future you will be. So, welcome to the very first episode of Children's Bible Quiz, the greatest theological game show of all time. Isn't that right, children? Yeah, so how this show works is essentially we do Bible trivia, Bible quiz games with my two contestants, Heinrich and Hezekiah.
Hello.
Who are both
Hello.
young Lutheran children. They're here to compete against each other to see who will be the smartest of the two. And yeah, the show is basically just Bible trivia and other Bible quizzes, and the two contestants will compete against each other, and we're going to use the game, though, to help us talk a bit about theology. The games are just an excuse. Yeah, I don't think any other Lutheran podcasters ever used that tagline before, so that sounds pretty original, doesn't it, Heinrich? You've never heard anyone else use that tagline before?
Yes, Table Talk Radio.
Alright, well, we'll just forget about them right now. We're the new Lutheran theological game show. So yeah, basically, this is going to be one of our standard games, which is Bible trivia. We will have some other games in future episodes, but Bible trivia, I think, is going to be a pretty standard one. So what I've got here is I've got some Bible quiz cards, broken up into 4 categories: yellow cards, green cards, red cards, and blue cards. And what the boys here are going to do for me is they're going to take it in turns, back and forth, and they're each going to have 3 questions. If they both answer the 3 questions correctly, or even if they just get a tie going with 2 correct or 1 correct, even none correct, if it comes down to it, we'll have a tiebreaker question at the end. Even just for the fun of the show, we will still do the tiebreaker, even if we don't need to do a tiebreaker, but just for a bit of fun, we'll throw it in at the end. So 7 questions for the episode. How it's going to work is we're going to go in turns, and for at least this episode, Heinrich being the oldest, we'll get you to go first. I'm going to pass you my Urim and Thummim. No, just kidding, they're just a pair of dice. Urim and Thummim, children, are the dice-like things that the Levitical priests were to roll to determine God's will. What Heinrich's going to do is he's going to roll the dice, so we'll just start with question number 1. Heinrich, would you like to roll the dice? And so what we have here is this dice says number 2, and this dice says number 5. So number 2 is going to go the piles in front of us. So what we've got here is the green cards, and for those who would like to see, the category is cattle and calves. And the other dice you rolled was a number 5, which is going to be your question. So the question for you, Heinrich, is what animal did God's fire burn up in Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal?
A bull.
Alright, now what we're going to do, though, is rather than me just tell Heinrich the answer straight away, these cards have Bible verses on them. We are going to look up that Bible verse, read the Bible verse, discuss the story a little bit, and see whether or not Heinrich is correct. So, this story comes from the first book of Kings, chapter 18. And during this event, what we have going on is Elijah has a contest with the prophets of Baal to determine, well, which God is the real God. And what they do is they both build an altar. And the prophets of Baal, they build their altar, and they then dance around trying to get Baal to rain down fire from heaven to consume the altar. Because Elijah said, well, if Baal's such a real God, he should be able to do this miraculous raining down fire from heaven. And then the prophets of Baal dance around, and they even cut themselves and try to do a whole bunch of silly things to get Baal to answer them. And Heinrich, do you remember what Elijah says to the prophets of Baal to mock them? He said,
He might be sleeping on the toilet.
yeah. And then, after all this time, nothing happens. And so then Elijah says that it's his turn to try. And what he does is he takes 12 stones. That's one stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he stacks them up, and he calls upon the name of the Lord, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he builds an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench around the altar as great as would contain 2 sheafers of seed. Ooh, so a sheafar, it says here, is about 7.3 litres. So we're looking at about 14 litres would go into this trench. And Elijah then put his wood on the altar, and he cut up a bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. He then got them to fill 4 jars with water and to pour it on the altar, on top of the burnt offering of the bull and on the wood. And then he said, do it a second time, and then do it a third time. So how many jugs in total would that be full of water?
3.
Well, 3 times, but each 3 times there was 4 jugs involved. 3 lots of 4 is 12. And that again would be 12 jugs of water for the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Elijah called out to God, and God rained down fire that not only consumed the bull, also the wood, and also the stones. So there's a lot going on here, children, because you've got a fire coming down from heaven, which then not only sets on fire the bull, but the bull was soaking wet. And so the bull is burnt up, the wood is burnt up, and then the rocks are burnt up also. And now, rocks melt at roughly about 1,000 degrees Celsius. If you want them to evaporate into just nothingness like they did here, basically burn the rocks up to ash, you're going to need an even hotter fire. And yet Elijah was able to stand right next to that fire, and he didn't melt himself. Like, do you children remember in the story of the 3 Jews in the fiery furnace? What happened to the soldiers who stood nearby the furnace that threw the Jews in?
They got killed.
Yeah, the fire was so hot from the furnace that they died. So Elijah standing right next to the altar, if the fire was hot enough to evaporate rocks, should have melted Elijah too, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
But our God, he is so wonderful with his miracles. He has not only a great power that he's powerful enough to melt rocks, or to evaporate rocks, but he's also powerful enough and precise enough to only evaporate the rocks and to keep Elijah and everyone else standing by safe from the fire. What an amazing God we have. Isn't that right, children?
Mm.
And we read, what did Elijah put on the altar? A bull, as Heinrich said. So Heinrich, that is correct. You answered your first question right. That is 1 point for Heinrich. So now we're going to move on to our next contestant, Hezekiah. So now we're going to move on to our next contestant, young Mr. Hezekiah. Can you roll the dice to determine your question? So you rolled a 1, which is going to be the yellow cards, which is, for this case is Joseph in Egypt. Can you roll your second dice to determine your question, Hezekiah? You have a 4. So our question for you, Hezekiah, is what was the name of Joseph's younger brother? Do you remember his name, Hezekiah?
Benjamin.
Alrighty, let's look that up to see if that is the case. So, the Bible verse that we are given here comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 42. And the verse we have is verse 4, which reads, But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. So do you children remember what's happening here? Joseph is down in Egypt because his brothers had sold him into slavery. And Joseph now had become the what of Egypt?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, roughly something along that job. He was second only to Pharaoh, and he was in charge of running the country. And there was a great famine, and Joseph had stored up all the grain during the 7 good years of plenty, and now into the 7 years of famine, and his brothers have come down to buy grain. And Joseph accused them of being spies, because he wanted to test them to see if they had changed from being so naughty. And he said, look, I'm going to keep one of your brothers here. And I believe he picked Simeon. And he said, you guys won't get Simeon back until you come back here with my brother Benjamin. But Jacob didn't want to send Benjamin, because Jacob, being a bit naughty, he had 13 children, 12 sons and a daughter, with 4 different women. And 2 of those children, Joseph and his younger brother Benjamin, were born to Rachel, which was the wife that Jacob loved the most. And so he very much valued the children of Rachel. And Joseph had already now, he assumed, was dead, and so he didn't want to lose Benjamin either. And so he made sure that Benjamin stayed home. And so, who was the younger brother? Benjamin, as Hezekiah answered. So Hezekiah, that's a point for you as well. So we're going to go back to Heinrich for his second question. Can you roll the first dice, Heinrich, to determine your category? Category 3, which are the red cards, with today is going to be John the Baptist. So Heinrich, can you roll your second card for your question? Number 3. Ooh, this one might be a bit of an easy question. What was the name that the angel told Zechariah to name his son?
John.
Well, let's look it up to see if you're correct. So, as we're looking this up, this comes from the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And Zechariah at this time was serving in the temple. Now, we don't know exactly because the text doesn't say, but church tradition has interpreted this passage as taking place on the day of Yom Kippur, or as we say in English, the Day of Atonement, which was the one day in the year in which the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. So you remember, there's the temple, and there's the outer court where the Gentiles and the women could go. Then there was the inner court where the men could go. Then there, inside the temple, was the holy place where only the priests could go. And then there was the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, where the Ark of God was kept. And the only person who could go in there was the high priest on the Day of Atonement. And as we know from the Gospels, there seemed to be this changing around of the high priest, so that there was the high priest of that year. And the church has traditionally interpreted this situation of Zechariah being in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, when the angel Gabriel appears to him to tell him that he is going to go home and he's going to have a child. That him and his wife in their old age would have a child. And in verse 13 we are told that the angel said, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." Which is the answer Heinrich gave. So that's another point for Heinrich. So Hezekiah, let's see if you can tie this up with your second question. Can you roll your first dice, Hezekiah, to determine which question you're going to have? 6, which we don't have 6 piles, so you get to pick. You've got a choice of King Solomon, donkeys or beasts of burden, plagues, and Paul in Rome. Which would you like to pick from?
Plagues.
You like to pick the plagues? Now can you roll your dice for your question? You rolled another 6, and there's actually only 5 questions on the card, so you get to pick question number 1 through to 5. I know the questions.
4.
You're going to pick number 4. So Hezekiah, how did the angel of death know which houses to pass over?
Because the One with the red painted on its door means the angel has to pass over.
And what was painted on the door?
Blood.
Yeah, so let's check this up. So now we are looking at the Passover back in the book of Exodus. And so God had instructed his people that they were to take a lamb that was without blemish and they were to sacrifice it. And this was to set up a foreshadowing of the coming of Christ. Back to the book of Exodus and the story of the Passover. So this was the 10th and the final plague, which was the plague of the what children?
The Passover.
Yes, but the plague, what got destroyed? The plague of the
firstborn.
That's right, Hezekiah. And so God was sending his angel to come and kill all the firstborn. Not just the humans, but even the livestock, from the lowliest slave all the way up to Pharaoh himself. And God was to protect the people of Israel, and he told them to do something, that they were to take a lamb, and they were to kill it, and they were to have this big Passover meal, and they were to take the lamb's blood, and they were to paint it on the doorposts. And this then would be a sign to the angel to pass over the house and not destroy the people therein. And the Passover lamb then serves as a foreshadowing of Christ in the New Testament, because St. Peter tells us in his epistles that Jesus is our Passover lamb. That his blood was shed upon the cross, and the blood of Jesus now covers us, so that when it comes time for us to be judged, and the angel of judgment, the accusing angel, the devil, comes to take us off to hell, we are covered by the blood of Christ, and he has to pass over us. And so, Hezekiah, you were right. They painted blood on the doorposts. So that's another point for you. So we're now tied up at 2-2, and we're now coming to Heinrich's third and final question. Can you roll your first dice for the cards? 4, which is going to be our blue cards, and this one is going to be Paul in Rome. So Heinrich, can you roll your dice for your question? 5. Ooh. This might be a hard one for you, Heinrich. I'm not sure if you know this one, but give it a try. So, St. Paul wrote a letter, an epistle, as we call them, to a man named Philemon. And in that, he is talking about a runaway slave. Do you know the name of that slave? Do you want to have a guess at any name as to who might be the slave who ran away? You have a think while I quickly get the book open. Would you like to have a guess, Heinrich? You're just that stumped?
Yeah.
So you just want to say no answer?
No.
Alrighty, well let us read from the book of Bible. So what happens here is that there was a slave who ran away from his master. His master was Philemon, a wealthy Christian, and the slave ran away, and he came and he lived with Paul. And he was a great help to Paul, and Paul is sending him back, and he's writing a letter to Philemon saying, look, don't be harsh to this guy. Forgive him as a brother in Christ, and he's been a big help to me. So maybe you should treat him like a brother in Christ, because he's run away because you've been rather mean to him. But he's your brother in Christ, so you should be nice to him and treat him well. And he writes, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I have become in my imprisonment. So Paul's saying, look, your slave Onesimus, he's like a child to me, and I've become like a father to him. So please look after him, treat him well. And so the slave's name was Onesimus. So, sorry Heinrich, you don't get a point for that. So Hezekiah has the ability here to win the game if he gets this next question correct. Hezekiah, would you be able to roll your first dice and see what category we'll go for today? Category 3, which is a red section, which is going to be Paul's arrest. And would you be able to roll your dice for your question? 2. Alright, Hezekiah. So, while Paul was under arrest, He was held under guard in Caesarea in what place? Where was he being kept held under guard? Do you want to have a guess? Do you also kind of stumped and don't know? You know, some of these questions are easy and some are a little bit harder for young fellas. I don't know if I'd necessarily know this one off the top of my head either. So, do you know Hezekiah? So you're gonna... Can you say pass? Or you don't know?
No.
You don't know?
I don't know.
Alrighty, so we're going to look it up. So Paul was arrested because the Jews were cranky at him and they had come and attacked him. And at first he got arrested because they thought that Paul was stirring up the crowds. But then Paul was actually innocent. But the Jews were trying to kill him, so the soldiers had to keep Paul safe. And while he was being looked after by the governor Felix, Felix kept him under guard in a particular place in Caesarea. And we read here that Felix said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And then Felix commanded that Paul be put in guard in Herod's palace. So he was kept safe in the palace of, at this point in time, Herod Agrippa II. And so it was in Herod's palace that Paul was being kept under guard. Now, do you children, why would Herod's palace be a good place to keep someone under guard? Do you guys know?
No.
Well, would the palace be a safe place or a not safe place if people were trying to break in and get somebody?
A safe place.
Yeah, I mean, it's the palace for the king. So he's got lots of guards. And so if the king's got a lot of protection and he's made sure that his palace is nice and fortified that no one can break in, then, well, it's got to be a safe place where anybody... So it's got to be a safe place where nobody can just break in and get Paul either. Alrighty then. So after 3 questions each, we're tied up, which 2 points to Heinrich and 2 points to Hezekiah, which means it's time for our tiebreaker question. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to roll the first dice, and our category is Beasts of Burden. So we're looking at donkeys here, and I'm going to roll another dice for a question, and as soon as I read the question, it's first one out of you two to answer correctly. So it doesn't necessarily mean who's first to answer, because if you answer wrong, then the other person gets a chance to think about and have an answer. So let's try. The question is going to be question number 3. Alrighty. For the win here. First person to answer. What was the special thing that Balaam's donkey was allowed to do? So God, hold on, I'll finish. God allowed Balaam's donkey to do a special miracle. What was that special thing? Go!
Speak! Talk!
What did you say, Heinrich?
I said speak.
So, Heinrich... So, okay. Heinrich got in first. I didn't really understand what you said. That's why I had to clarify, because it sounded like you said beat. I don't know what... No. Balaam was beating the donkey, not the other way around. Yes, speak. So, Heinrich, let's check if that is correct. So, do you children remember the story of Balaam's donkey? So, this takes place in the book of Numbers, when there was a guy named Balak, who was the king of the Moabites, the enemies of Israel. And he had tried to hire Balaam, who was like an oracle. So kind of like a prophet, but more like he was a pagan prophet. So he kind of used demons and demonic powers to pronounce blessings and curses on people. And so Balak tried to hire Balaam to come and do that against the people of Israel. And Balaam originally said, "Nah, I'm not going." But then God said, no, go. I'm going to use you. And then so Balaam got on his donkey and he started going. But then God's anger was kindled against Balaam for going. But that sounds confusing. Didn't God tell Balaam to go?
Yes.
Yeah, this, while God is angry, is because Balaam is going, though, to do what Balak wants to do, though. So he did go like God said, but he wasn't intending to say what God wanted him to say. So this is why God had to make sure Balaam would do what God wanted him to do. So God sent the angel of the Lord to speak in front of him. However, we are told later that this angel of the Lord said, I did this and I did that, knowing that the angel of the Lord here must be the Lord himself. So who is that then? Which figure is this?
Jesus.
Yeah, because Jesus is not only God himself, but he's also the angel or messenger of God. And so 3 times Balaam's donkey sees Jesus standing there with a big sword drawn to kill Balaam. And the donkey tries to save Balaam by turning aside. And yet Balaam, he's blind to this. He can't see Jesus standing in front of him. And so first the donkey tries to go off into a field, and Balaam's like, you naughty donkey, and gets out his rod and whips her and makes her get back on the path. And then the angel stood there where there is a path going between vineyards, and there was a wall on one side and a wall on another side. And so when the donkey tried to turn, Balaam hurt his foot on the wall, and he hit the donkey again. He's like, you stupid donkey, stop it. And then God stood there another time, and the donkey, this time, unable to turn around, just sat down. And Balaam took out his rod a 3rd time and hit the donkey a 3rd time, saying, you stupid donkey, what are you doing? And it's at that moment that God gave the donkey the ability to speak. And the donkey said, What are you doing? I've been a good and faithful donkey my whole life, and all you're doing is hitting me when I'm trying to save you. And it was at that moment that God opened Balaam's eyes and was able to see Jesus standing there with a sword. And then he was repentant, and he said, God, I won't go. And God's like, no, do go, but you are going to go and only speak to Balak what I, God, tell you to speak. And so, as we read there, what was the miracle the donkey could do? The donkey could speak. And with our tiebreaker round, Heinrich was the first to answer. So, for the very first episode of Children's Bible Quiz, our champion for this episode is Heinrich. Hooray for Heinrich. Woo! Yeah. Alrighty. Well, thanks Heinrich and Hezekiah for helping out on this episode. I don't know how often I'm going to do this show. I'd love to do this show weekly if we could. We're going to see how we go. So, stay tuned for future episodes. Hopefully they'll be weekly. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.